The American economy has always been divided, but it is in situations when its force is put to the proof where we can see how damaging this can be. While some states are on a countdown to retake their regular business activities, others don't even consider reopening yet. The effects of the lockdown are hitting the economy increasingly harder, and even before that, we all know it was already pretty badly bruised. Everything is out of balance. Unemployment rates are skyrocketing, businesses are bankrupting, shortages are coming, and the feeling of general uncertainty is spreading faster and faster. The fiscal and monetary policies that were supposed to help may cause even more damage. There are so many stimulus programs to ease the crisis that they don't even make sense anymore because they aren't really fixing anything. It's like putting a Band-Aid on an exposed fracture. The Federal Reserve alone has more than 10 programs to purchase debt. Many of these programs are relying on some sort of bailout the Treasury had given to the Fed to be used as a special purpose vehicle of $425 billion in taxpayers' money. So yeah, we are paying for all of this. Meanwhile, Congress has been gradually authorizing billions in new spendings. It's expected to surpass $5 trillion by the end of the fiscal year. As taxpayers' money isn't infinite, the ability of central banks to print money actually is. So the Fed has been printing money out of thin air for years because their monetary policies had proven to be ineffective at some points. And despite the naive expectations stimulus supporters have of boosting the economy through the checks citizens are collecting, believing consumer spending would increase, recent surveys had shown that only 38% of the recipients had saved some money, and 26% had paid off their debt. So actually, the stimulus is not stimulating the economy nor the consumer. It's only stimulating the rise in the deficit and the rise in the national debt. This $2 trillion plan that has been approved last month, which will allegedly provide $1,200 checks for Americans who receive under $75,000 a year, plus $500 per child, may seem a good help for families in times like these. But if you look a little closer, you realize that it's not. We're not saying that the government shouldn't help jobless people, help families in lockdown, or try to find a way out of this. We're just trying to tell you that this isn't an adequate response to the extent of this situation. Imagine that you're hungry, and the only thing that can be given to you is chewing gum. Let's suppose that at first you won't be bothered. Hey, you love chewing gum. But then you realize it doesn't feed you, it doesn't give you the strength you need, it doesn't nourish you, and ultimately it starts to make you feel sick. That's what money printing does. At first you feel better for having a support that helps you deal with the situation, but eventually you'll realize that you can't afford the common goods you used to afford a couple of months ago. And lastly, you face the fact this money actually contributed to make you even poorer, and the economy even weaker. This happens because it essentially debases the currency by reducing its purchasing power. Even though it's called MMT, Modern Monetary Theory, there is nothing modern to it. As we referred to it in a previous video, this theory isn't commonly known as magic money tree for no reason. Every fallen empire, even the Byzantines and the Romans, have used these tactics. As it was stated on news.bitcoin.com, ancient empires and modern governments have always been inflating the money supply to the point of just print more attitude to become infectious. They say that basic economics clearly shows that the increase of any money supply causes inflation and reduces purchasing power. The reason for this is because a spike in demand exceeds supply, causing the prices for everything to jump higher. In present-day America, this basically consists of a merger between the balance sheets of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve done by the U.S. government, treating them as if they were a consolidated entity. Under this theory, all wealth comes from the government, and the more money it's spent, the more money there will be. So the Treasury can spend as much money as it wants on anything it wants, and it finances this spending by issuing bonds. This is where the Fed steps in. If the private sector isn't interested in buying these bonds or is demanding too high of an interest rate, the Fed can just turn on the printing press, print the money that's needed, and buy the bonds with the money they created, adding these bonds on its balance sheet. Et voila! The problem is gone with the wind, but it will come back as a tornado. This is how economic bubbles are formed. By giving the Treasury an unlimited line of credit to spend as much as it wants, the Fed ends up creating massive inflation. Most bonds come due in 10 or 30 years, so the Treasury can repeat this same process using newly printed money to pay for the old printed money. And when inflation breaks out, it only takes a little blow to create an avalanche. By now, the U.S. government's deficit is around $23 trillion. Plus interest, oh yeah, plus the trillions that were recently authorized to be created, which leaves us in an everlasting debt loop. At the same time, the value of the U.S. dollar is being reduced because eventually there will be more money than products and services. To summarize, over the years, U.S. politicians became addicted to selling debt to generations that weren't even born yet. The Fed calls this measure quantitative easing, and these last 30 years of a supposed progress in America has been set by this non-stopping debt machine. Ironically enough, to battle the rising inflation, the regular solution is higher taxes and increasing austerity measures. Politicians claim to take this money from the well-off part of society and big corporations, but actually, they're only leaving this debt to be paid by future generations. Meltem Demirors, a CoinShares executive, had affirmed that taxation was always part of the plan. He declared on his Twitter feed that the U.S. expects to collect close to $4 trillion in taxes in 2021. Over 75% of it comes out of our paychecks, as individual income tax and payroll tax. Now, like many people, the U.S. government spends more than it makes. Before the recent turmoil, the U.S. government's 2021 budget was expected to have a deficit of $966 billion. Since we've been doing this for a while, the total national deficit is $23 trillion. It's more than the entire GDP of the U.S. in any given year. If you add in unfunded liabilities, the number's closer to $120 trillion. $120 trillion equals $798,000 per taxpayer. And the executive continued by notifying that 35% of the U.S. workforce, boomers, are set to retire in the next decade. They also account for the biggest budget liability, relying on pensions, Social Security, Medicare, money that simply isn't there. If you're thinking the future seems like a dark place to be, it's because it is. With the dollar losing its status, the hyperinflation will definitely wreck the economy, especially if the Fed keeps supporting the stock market the way it's been doing. Wealth disparities will shoot even higher, leading us to social unrest, looting, and riots. In fact, this has already started in some places. As it was reported on Inside's website last Saturday, several dozen protesters disobeyed social distancing guidelines at a rally at the Capitol building in Austin, Texas, against the state's lockdown policy. The professor of sociology at Albertus Magnus College in Connecticut, Karen Kendrick, told Insider that poverty, crime, hunger, social upheaval are a real threat in the U.S. too, especially if the government doesn't step in to soften the blow, as she analyzes the cases of civil unrest that's happened all over the world in the past few weeks. In Italy, there are now police patrols on the supermarkets to stop people stealing food. Last Tuesday in Mumbai, thousands of unemployed laborers demonstrated at a railway station after the Prime Minister Narendra Modi extended the national lockdown. In Brazil, many cities already have their hospitals in half capacity or completely full. The government has been denying to pay about $120 a month for those who are unemployed or don't configure as essential workers. making millions of citizens in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro banging pots and pans from their windows to protest about Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. The report also covers that in Lansing, Michigan, armed protesters were holding Confederate flags and signs calling their governor a Nazi. Last week, similar demonstrations had also taken place in Indianapolis, Salt Lake City, and Columbus, Ohio. Simultaneously, supermarkets, grocery stores, and farmers markets are already reporting food shortages as people continue to hoard canned goods, cleaning supplies, and toilet paper to their stockpiles, while farmers and ranchers have been posting on social media that they're literally being forced to throw away thousands of pounds of food every day because they're not allowed to sell them. Last Wednesday, the International Monetary Fund published a report alerting that the health crisis could fuel riots in many countries around the globe if people are left with no jobs or money for food during and after this situation. The Wall Street Journal had also declared that the New York Police Department has seen a 75% increase in burglaries of businesses. Professor Kendrick goes on affirming that after World War II, ever since America had started to build up a big middle class, we created a strong base that was economically secure enough that they weren't willing to risk much. This crisis is highly likely to disrupt that. At that point, I don't see how we can avoid social unrest. There's no doubt this is going to have huge economic and social impacts, and the worse it is, the more likely that people are going to get to the point where social action is the only move forward. With class disparities being aggravated by the effects of this crisis, social distancing breaking groups apart, risen scarcity in goods at the stores, violence and crime becoming an unexceptional reality around the world, and in an even more aggravating sphere, government leaders failing to asset the issue properly, we have the perfect recipe for a disaster.